Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're getting into a true story, a true testimonial using the law of assumption from an extremely successful businessman. And this is actually Neville Goddard's brother. He doesn't actually say it in the story, but this is exactly who this is. Okay, so this is a striking story of an extremely successful businessman demonstrating the power of imagination and the law of assumption. So this is a story that demonstrates the power of imagination, your power of imagination, and the law of assumption. And Neville Goddard says, I know this family intimately, which is, it's actually his family. And all the details were told to me by the son described herein. The story begins when he was 20 years old. He was next to the oldest in a large family of 9 brothers and 1 sister. The father was one of the partners in a small merchandising business. In his 18th year, the brother referred to in this story left the country in which they lived. So he left the country in which they lived and traveled 2,000 miles to enter college and complete his education. Shortly after his first year in college, he was called home because of a tragic event in connection with his father's business. Through the machinations of his associates, the father was not only forced out of his business, but was the object of false accusations and impugning his character and integrity. At the same time, he was deprived of his rightful share in the equity of the business. The result was he found himself largely discredited and almost penniless. It was under these circumstances that the son was called home from college. He returned, his heart filled with one great resolution. He was determined that he would become outstandingly successful in business. The first thing he and his father did was to use the little money they had to start their own business. They rented a small store on a side street not far from the large business of which the father had been one of the principal owners. There they started a business bent upon a real service to the community. It was shortly thereafter that the son, with instinctive awareness that it was bound to work, deliberately used his imagination to attain an almost fantastic objective. This is another thing that happened to Neville Goddard when he was growing up, because this is his brother Victor that did this. And just witnessing these things and his brother talking about them actually started to make Neville believe in his imagination, and that imagination actually creates reality. This is actually one of the stories, one of the foundational stories that created Neville Goddard's work, is the things that he actually saw with his own eyes and was very observant of the way that things were being created. Okay, so it was shortly thereafter the son, with instinctive awareness that it was bound to work, deliberately used his imagination to attain an almost fantastic objective. Every day on the way to and from work, he passed the building of his father's former business, the biggest business of its kind in the country. It was one of the largest buildings. This is in Barbados, okay, with the most prominent location in the heart of the city. On the outside of the building was a huge sign on which the name of the firm was painted in large, bold letters. Day after day, as he passed by, a great dream took shape in the son's mind. This is Victor, Neville Goddard's brother. He thought of how wonderful it would be if it was his family that had this great building, his family that owned and operated this great business. One day, as he stood gazing at the building in his imagination, he saw a completely different name on the huge sign across the entrance. Now the large letters spelled out his family's name. In these case histories, the actual names are not used for the sake of clarity. In this story, we will use hypothetical names and assume that the son's family's name was Lordard, which was actually Goddard. Okay, so where the sign read FN Moth and Company, in imagination, he actually saw the name letter by letter, N. Lordard and Sons. He remained looking at the sign with his eyes wide open, imagining that it read N. Lordard and Sons twice a day. So he did this in his imagination. He did this twice a day, week after week, month after month, for 2 years. He persisted in seeing this sign saying Goddard and Sons, not FN Moth and Company, but he was actually seeing Neville or N. Goddard and Sons, and he remained attentive to this imaginal scene in his mind, and he persisted in it. Okay, so He was convinced that if he felt strongly enough that a thing was true, it was bound to be the case. And by seeing in imagination his family's name on the sign, which implied that they owned the business, he became convinced that one day they would own it. Okay, so during this period, he told only one person what he was doing. He confided in his mother, who, with loving concern, tried to discourage him in order to protect him for what might be a great disappointment. Despite this, he persisted day after day. He persisted, remember that word right there, persistence, day after day. 2 years later, the large company failed, and the coveted building was up for sale. On the day of the sale, he seemed no nearer ownership than he had 2 years before when he began to apply the law of assumption. During this period, they had worked hard and their customers had implicit confidence in them. However, they had not earned anything like the amount of money required for the purchase of the property, nor did they have any source from which they could borrow the necessary capital. Making even more remote their chance of getting it was the fact that this was regarded as the most desirable property in the city, and a number of wealthy business people were prepared to buy it. On the actual day of sale, to their complete surprise, a man, almost a total stranger, came into their shop and offered to buy the property for them. Due to some unusual conditions involved in this transaction, the son's family could not even make a bid for the property. They thought the man was joking. However, this was not the case. The man explained that he had watched them for some time, admired their ability, believed in their integrity, and that supplying the capital for them to go into business on a large scale was an extremely sound investment for him. That very day, the property was theirs. What the son had persisted in, seeing in his imagination, was now a reality. The hunch of the stranger was more than justified. So his imaginal act created this. Okay, so his imaginal act, seeing the sign say N. Goddard and Sons, actually created this whole thing. We shifted his reality, it shifted his world, or his parallel realities. He shifted into that world that corresponded with what he was seeing. So anything could have happened. Anything could have happened that was going to create this to happen. If you persist in it, it will happen, because you're not taking anything away from anyone else, because there's an infinite amount of those buildings in all these infinite parallel universes. So an infinite amount of people could own that. But in his world, he created this imaginal scene. He saw it in his mind. So he shifted to that world where the building was his family's. And that's what you can do as well. You're not taking anything from anyone. Regardless of what you do, you try to create a relationship or a lot of money. It doesn't matter what you're creating. You're not taking anything from anyone else, because there's an infinite amount of yous and there's an infinite amount of me's. So there can be an infinite amount of people with an infinite amount of versions of you in different worlds. And you can do this with anything. That's the power of imagination and the law of assumption and the infinite realities that we live in, the parallel realities that we live in. Anything is possible. All right, so today this family owns not only the particular business referred to, but also owns many of the largest industries in the country in which they live. All right, so this also created the integrity of the business too. Him doing this created their family to be integral as well and honest, and made other people want to invest in them. The son, seeing his family name over the entrance of this great building long before it was actually there, was using exactly the technique that produces results, by assuming the feeling that he already had what he desired, by making this a vivid reality in his imagination. By determined persistence, regardless of appearance or circumstance, he inevitably caused the dream to become a reality. He caused his dream to be a reality by persisting and seeing that sign say what he wanted to say night after night, day after day, visualizing even for a couple minutes a day or even 30 seconds a day, seeing this in your mind's eye, and persisting in this feeling. All right, guys, that is the end of this case history, but we'll be getting into case number 3. But I think that this case history that we just went over with Neville Goddard's brother, Victor, is actually going to help a lot of people understand, have the power that you have within you and the infinite realities that we're living in. You can transfer to any reality that you want, depending on what you feel to be true in your current world. You can shift to that parallel reality, the congruent reality with what you feel is true in your world, what you consent to as true based on your concept of yourself. So you can change this by seeing something in your mind's eye, which also created a new version of him and his family in order to get to that layer of the universe or the subconscious mind in the hologram, actually lined up with that business being his and all the other businesses. So they're imagining the best at all times and creating, the world that they want to be living in. But I know this case history right here is going to help a lot of people that actually watch this video. All right, guys, that is the end of this video, and feel free to leave any comments or questions that you have, and I read every single comment you guys leave, so leave any comment, questions, and give me one thing you guys are grateful for. I noticed that not enough people are leaving what they're grateful for in the comment box below. You guys used to do really, really good with this. I want you guys to leave one thing you guys are grateful for in the comment box below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.